The chalk dust settled like snow across the classroom floor as Sarah Chen knelt beside her overturned desk, gathering scattered worksheets and broken pencils. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the fragments of what had once been her favorite coffee mug, the one her sister had given her with "World's Best Teacher" printed in bold letters. Now it lay in pieces, much like her confidence after only 3 weeks at Riverside High School. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the mathematics equations still visible on the whiteboard. Sarah had spent hours the night before preparing today's lesson on quadratic functions, complete with real-world applications that she hoped would spark even the most reluctant students' interest. Instead, she found herself cleaning up the aftermath of what the administration would likely classify as another minor classroom disruption. Her pristine lesson plans were now scattered across the linoleum, covered in muddy footprints from the designer sneakers that had deliberately trampled them. The carefully organized supplies she had purchased with her own limited salary lay strewn about like casualties of war. But it wasn't the material damage that cut deepest, it was the echo of cruel laughter that still rang in her ears, the memory of cold eyes watching her humiliation with satisfaction. Sarah Chen had arrived at Riverside High with dreams as bright as the autumn leaves that adorned the school's sprawling campus. Fresh out of her master's program in mathematics education, she carried with her an unwavering belief that every student could succeed if given the right tools and encouragement. Her reference letters spoke of innovation, dedication, and an remarkable ability to connect with challenging students. What they didn't mention was the quiet strength that had been forged through years of disciplined training in traditional karate, a detail she kept carefully private. The morning of her first day, Sarah had stood before the mirror in her small apartment, adjusting the blazer she had bought specifically for this moment. At 26, she appeared younger than her years, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle demeanor that masked an inner resilience most people never glimpsed. Her long black hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she wore minimal makeup, preferring to let her passion for teaching speak louder than any outward appearance. Riverside High School was considered one of the more challenging assignments in the district, known for its diverse student body and complex social dynamics. The previous math teacher, Mr. Henderson, had retired mid-semester after what the administration diplomatically termed health concerns. Sarah later learned from whispered conversations in the faculty lounge that Henderson had suffered what appeared to be a stress-induced breakdown, though the exact circumstances remained shrouded in carefully maintained silence. The red brick building had an imposing presence, its 3 stories housing nearly 2,000 students from vastly different backgrounds. Wealthy families from the hill districts sent their children alongside kids from the struggling neighborhoods. Near the river, this economic diversity created a unique powder keg of social tensions, with established hierarchies that had solidified over years of unspoken rules and carefully maintained power structures. Principal Michael Rodriguez had greeted Sarah with enthusiasm tempered by what she now recognized as carefully concealed concern. A man in his early 50s with graying temples and tired eyes, Rodriguez had built his career on maintaining stability in an inherently unstable environment. During their initial meeting, he had spoken in measured tones about classroom management challenges and diverse learning needs, diplomatic language that barely masked the underlying tensions she would soon discover. The mathematics department consisted of 5 teachers, each carrying the weariness of educators who had learned to choose their battles carefully. Department head Margaret Foster, a woman nearing retirement with 30 years of experience, had taken Sarah under her wing, with the protective instincts of someone who had seen too many promising young teachers leave. After brief, traumatic tenures, during Sarah's orientation, Margaret had pulled her aside for what she called a reality check conversation. They sat in the empty faculty lounge, surrounded by motivational posters whose cheerful messages seemed to mock the exhaustion visible in Margaret's expression. The veteran teacher spoke in low tones about certain students who wielded influence far beyond Their years, families whose wealth translated into untouchable status, and administrative pressures that often prioritized peace over justice. Sarah's first week had passed in a blur of lesson planning, grade book organization, and the inevitable adjustment period that came with any new position. Her classroom, room 137, occupied a corner of the second floor with large windows that overlooked the student parking lot. She had spent her own money decorating the space with colorful posters, depicting mathematical concepts in everyday situations, hoping to make the subject more accessible and engaging. The student body at Riverside represented a complex ecosystem of social groups, each with its own territory, traditions, and unwritten codes of conduct. There were the academic achievers who clustered near the library, the athletes who dominated the cafeteria's central tables, the artists who gathered in the courtyard, and various smaller cliques that formed around shared interests or circumstances. But hovering above them all was a group that seemed to exist outside normal social boundaries, operating with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. This elite circle centered around 3 students whose names were spoken with a mixture of awe and apprehension throughout the hallways. Tyler Morrison stood as their unofficial leader, a senior whose family owned several successful businesses throughout the county. His father sat on the school board, his mother chaired the parent-teacher organization, and his older brother had been valedictorian before accepting a full scholarship to an Ivy League university. Tyler possessed the kind of effortless charisma that made adults overlook his more troubling behaviors, while simultaneously making peers desperate for his approval. Beside him stood Marcus Webb, whose athletic prowess on the football field had already attracted attention from college scouts despite being only a junior. Standing 6 feet 3 inches with the broad shoulders of someone who had been lifting weights since middle school, Marcus commanded respect through sheer physical presence. His family's construction company had built half the new developments in town, and his uncle served as the district's athletic director, creating a web of influence that extended far beyond the classroom. The third member of their trio was Jessica Kane, whose beauty and sharp wit had made her the undisputed queen of Riverside's social hierarchy. Her father owned the largest law firm in the county, and her mother had been homecoming queen at the same school 25 years earlier. Jessica possessed an intuitive understanding of social dynamics that allowed her to manipulate situations with surgical precision, always maintaining plausible deniability while orchestrating events from behind the scenes. Together, these 3 had created an atmosphere where their word carried more weight than most teachers' authority. They moved through the hallways like royalty, surrounded by a rotating court of admirers and followers who competed for their attention. Their influence extended beyond mere popularity. They had cultivated relationships with key faculty members, maintained perfect attendance records, and participated in enough extracurricular activities to appear well-rounded on paper. Sarah's first encounter with this power structure occurred during her second week, when Tyler had arrived 15 minutes late to her advanced algebra class with a Starbucks coffee and designer headphones round his neck. Rather than offering an apology or explanation, he had simply strolled to his seat with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced meaningful consequences for such behavior. When Sarah gently reminded him of the classroom policy regarding tardiness and beverages, Tyler had smiled with practiced charm and responded that he had been meeting with Coach Williams about his college prospects. The explanation carried just enough legitimacy to make challenging it seem petty, yet something in his tone suggested he was testing her boundaries rather than offering a genuine excuse. The following day, Marcus had exhibited similar behavior, arriving late with muddy cleats that left tracks across Sarah's carefully maintained classroom floor. When she asked him to clean up after himself, he had chuckled and mentioned that his family's company was bidding on the school's upcoming renovation project, a detail that seemed unrelated to the immediate issue yet carried unmistakable implications. Jessica's approach proved more subtle but equally effective. She would arrive punctually and prepared, participating actively in class discussions with thoughtful questions and insightful observations. However, Sarah gradually noticed that Jessica's engagement often came at the expense of other students. as she would subtly redirect conversations or offer corrections that, while technically accurate, served to diminish her classmates' confidence. The pattern became clear during the third week, when Sarah assigned a group project requiring students to work collaboratively on real-world applications of linear equations. She had carefully structured the teams to mix different ability levels and social groups, hoping to foster cross-cultural understanding while reinforcing mathematical concepts. What she witnessed instead was a masterclass in social manipulation. Tyler's group quickly established him as the leader. Despite the fact that his mathematical skills were adequate at best, he delegated most of the actual work to more capable teammates while positioning himself as the spokesperson who would present their findings. When Sarah attempted to redirect the group dynamic to ensure equal participation, Tyler smoothly deflected her suggestions with references to natural leadership, abilities, and efficient task management. Marcus took a different approach, using his physical presence and athletic reputation to intimidate quieter group members into compliance. He would lean back in his chair with arms crossed, letting long silences stretch until someone else volunteered to handle the more challenging aspects of the assignment. When Sarah intervened to encourage his participation, Marcus would offer minimal effort while making it clear through body language and facial expressions that he considered the work beneath his attention. Jessica's manipulation proved the most sophisticated, as she would appear to encourage collaboration while subtly undermining the confidence of students who challenged her ideas. She had perfected the art of offering backhanded compliments and asking questions that sounded supportive but actually highlighted others' uncertainties. When Sarah recognized this pattern and attempted to address it privately, Jessica responded with wide-eyed innocence and expressions of confusion about what she might have done wrong. The breaking point came during the fourth week when Sarah decided to implement a new seating arrangement designed to break up established social clusters and encourage students to work with different partners. She had researched various classroom management strategies and felt confident that mixing up the social dynamics would benefit everyone's learning experience. The announcement of the new seating chart met with immediate resistance from Tyler's group, though their objections were framed in terms of academic concern rather than social preference. Tyler raised his hand and suggested that forcing high-achieving students to work with struggling learners might actually impede everyone's progress, a comment that managed to sound reasonable while revealing underlying attitudes about their classmates' worth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus voiced his opposition more directly, claiming that the new arrangement would interfere with his ability to focus due to learning style differences, a phrase he had clearly borrowed from education jargon without understanding its actual meaning. His tone carried an edge of challenge that made several other students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jessica's response proved characteristically subtle, as she expressed concern about how the change might affect students who were more comfortable in familiar environments, carefully positioning herself as an advocate for others while actually defending her own preferences. Her ability to make selfish concerns sound altruistic demonstrated a level of sophistication that impressed and troubled Sarah in equal measure. When Sarah proceeded with the seating change despite their objections, the atmosphere in the classroom shifted noticeably. The three students complied with the new arrangement but made their displeasure known through a series of small acts of defiance that remained just within the bounds of plausible deniability. Tyler would sigh dramatically when asked to work with certain partners. Marcus would take unnecessary bathroom breaks that disrupted the flow of lessons, and Jessica would ask pointed questions designed to highlight gaps in other students' understanding. More troubling was the way their behavior influenced the broader classroom dynamic. Students who had previously participated enthusiastically began to withdraw, sensing the underlying tension and unsure of how to navigate the shifting social currents. The collaborative atmosphere Sarah had worked to establish started to erode, as students became more guarded and less willing to take intellectual risks. The situation escalated when Sarah assigned a challenging problem set that required students to work in their new seating arrangements to solve complex word problems involving quadratic equations. She had designed the assignment to build confidence through collaborative success, but instead found herself watching as Tyler's group systematically undermined the exercise rather than engaging genuinely with the mathematical content. Tyler spent most of the class period making comments about how the problems were unrealistic and questioning whether such abstract concepts had any relevance to real life. His critique managed to sound intellectually curious while actually serving to discourage his teammates from investing effort in the work. Marcus adopted a strategy of learned helplessness, claiming confusion about concepts he had demonstrated understanding of in previous lessons. When his patient partner attempted to explain the solution process, Marcus would interrupt with questions that seemed designed more to frustrate than to clarify, eventually leading his teammate to complete the work independently while Marcus checked his phone. Jessica's approach involved offering to help struggling students in ways that actually increased their dependence and decreased their confidence. She would provide answers rather than guidance, explain concepts in unnecessarily complex terminology, and subtly suggest that some people were simply naturally better at mathematics than others. Sarah recognized that she was witnessing something far more serious than typical teenage resistance to authority. These students were demonstrating a level of calculated manipulation that suggested years of practice in undermining systems they found inconvenient. Their behavior patterns indicated an assumption that rules applied differently to them, and that challenges to their preferred arrangements could be neutralized through subtle but persistent pressure. The realization that she was dealing with sophisticated social manipulation rather than simple classroom management issues forced Sarah to reconsider her entire approach. She had been trained to handle academic challenges, motivational problems, and even behavioral disruptions, but her education had not prepared her for students who weaponized charm, influence, and psychological pressure to maintain their privileged positions. During her lunch break that day, Sarah sought advice from Margaret Foster, who listened to her concerns with the weary expression of someone who had heard similar stories too many times before. The veteran teacher explained that Tyler, Marcus, and Jessica represented the third generation of their families to attend Riverside High, and that each generation had successfully maintained the same patterns of behavior through a combination of academic achievement, extracurricular participation, and carefully cultivated relationships with influential adults. Margaret revealed that previous teachers who had attempted to challenge this dynamic had faced a predictable sequence of escalating pressure. First came subtle resistance designed to disrupt classroom environments, followed by parental complaints about teaching methods and classroom management issues. If educators persisted in their efforts to maintain consistent standards, they often found themselves facing formal complaints about their attitude toward high-achieving students or their ability to differentiate instruction appropriately. The conversation helped Sarah understand that she was not dealing with an isolated classroom problem, but rather with a systemic issue that had been allowed to develop over years of administrative reluctance to confront influential families. The school's dependence on donations, volunteer support, and political backing from wealthy parents had created an environment where certain students operated under different rules than their peers. Armed with this new understanding, Sarah began to document the patterns she observed more carefully. She started keeping detailed notes about specific incidents, recording dates, times, and witnesses to behaviors that disrupted the learning environment. Her years of martial arts training had taught her the importance of patience, observation, and strategic thinking skills that would prove invaluable in the challenge ahead. The first major confrontation occurred during the 5th week, when Tyler arrived at class with a smirk that immediately put Sarah on alert. He had spent the previous evening researching her background online, discovering details about her education, previous teaching experience, and even her apartment complex. Armed with this information, he began asking seemingly innocent questions about her qualifications that were actually designed to undermine her authority in front of other students. Tyler's questions started with inquiries about her previous teaching experience, noting that Riverside was her first full-time position and wondering aloud whether she felt prepared for the unique challenges of their particular student body. He managed to make these comments sound like genuine concern while actually planting seeds of doubt about her competence. When Sarah responded professionally by outlining her educational background and training, Tyler shifted tactics to question her teaching methods, comparing them unfavorably to those of the beloved Mr. Henderson. He mentioned specific techniques that Henderson had used, framing his comments as helpful suggestions while actually criticizing Sarah's different approach to instruction. The most troubling aspect of Tyler's behavior was how he managed to appear respectful and engaged to any observer while systematically working to undermine Sarah's classroom authority. His tone remained polite, his questions seemed academically focused, and his body language suggested genuine interest. Only someone watching carefully would notice how his comments consistently served to position himself as more knowledgeable than his teacher. Marcus and Jessica supported Tyler's efforts through their own subtle contributions to the undermining campaign. Marcus would nod knowingly when Tyler made his points, as if recognizing superior wisdom, while Jessica would ask follow-up questions that seemed to seek clarification, but actually amplified Tyler's criticisms. The psychological pressure of maintaining professional composure while being systematically challenged by teenagers who had clearly coordinated their approach began to take its toll on Sarah. She found herself second-guessing instructional decisions that would normally feel automatic, wondering whether student responses reflected genuine confusion or calculated resistance. The situation reached a crisis point when Sarah announced a pop quiz designed to assess student understanding of recently covered material. Pop quizzes were standard practice in mathematics education, serving both as formative assessment tools and motivation for consistent study habits. However, Tyler's group treated the announcement as a personal affront that required immediate escalation. Tyler raised his hand with exaggerated urgency and began voicing concerns about the fairness of unannounced assessments, particularly for students who had other commitments that limited their study time. He managed to frame his objection in terms of educational equity, suggesting that pop quizzes disadvantaged students with busy schedules and questioning whether such practices aligned with modern pedagogical approaches. Marcus supported Tyler's position by mentioning his football practice schedule and wondering aloud whether teachers should coordinate assessments with coaches to ensure that student-athletes could perform their best academically. His comments carried the implicit threat that poor performance might jeopardize the team's success, a consideration that held significant weight in a school where athletic achievement generated community pride and financial support. Jessica approached the issue from a different angle, expressing concern about how pop quizzes might affect students' stress levels and mental health. She referenced articles she had supposedly read about assessment anxiety and suggested that Sarah might want to reconsider her approach in light of current research on student well-being. The coordinated nature of their response made it clear that Tyler's group had discussed strategy in advance and prepared talking points designed to pressure Sarah into backing down. Their arguments were sophisticated enough to sound reasonable to casual observers while actually serving to challenge her basic authority to assess student learning as she saw fit. Sarah recognized that this moment would define her relationship with not only these 3 students, but the entire class. If she capitulated to their pressure, she would be establishing a precedent that her instructional decisions were subject to student approval. However, standing firm might trigger the escalation pattern that Margaret Foster had warned her about, drawing on the mental discipline she had cultivated through years of martial arts training. Sarah took a deep breath and responded with calm firmness. She acknowledged their concerns while explaining the educational rationale behind pop quizzes, noting that mathematics skills required consistent practice and that unannounced assessments helped identify areas where additional instruction was needed. Her response was measured, professional, and pedagogically sound, but she could see in Tyler's eyes that her refusal to be intimidated had escalated their conflict to a new level. The smile that crossed his face was not one of acceptance, but of someone who had just been given permission to implement more aggressive tactics. The quiz proceeded despite their objections, but the atmosphere in the classroom had fundamentally shifted. Tyler's group made their displeasure known through a series of passive-aggressive behaviors that remained just within the bounds of acceptable conduct. They took longer than necessary to clear their desks, asked multiple questions about instructions that were clearly written on the board, and maintained expressions of wounded innocence. Throughout the assessment, more significantly, their behavior influenced other students who began to question whether they should also object to the pop quiz. Sarah watched as uncertainty spread through the classroom, with students looking to Tyler's group for cues about how to respond. Rather than focusing on the mathematical content they were supposed to be demonstrating, the quiz results revealed what Sarah had suspected. Tyler, Marcus, and Jessica were capable students who had chosen to underperform as a form of protest, rather than because of any genuine academic difficulty. Their answers showed enough understanding to avoid failing grades, but demonstrated none of the mastery they had exhibited in previous work. When cooperation suited their purposes, after class, Sarah found herself emotionally drained in a way that had nothing to do with the intellectual demands of teaching. The constant vigilance required to maintain classroom authority, while being systematically challenged by students who operated with sophisticated manipulation tactics, was exhausting in ways her teacher training had not prepared her for. That evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment grading the pop quizzes, she reflected on how different this experience was from her student teaching placements, where challenges had been straightforward and solutions relatively clear. The complexity of dealing with students who possessed both academic ability and social power, while operating within systems that protected their behavior, required a different kind of strength. Entirely, she thought about the other students in her classes, the ones who came to school eager to learn, who asked genuine questions, and who treated their education as an opportunity rather than an entitlement. These students deserved a classroom environment where learning could flourish without the constant undercurrent of psychological manipulation and power struggles. The phone call came that evening, just as Sarah was finishing her lesson plans for the following day. The caller ID showed the school's main number, and she answered, expecting to hear from a colleague or administrator with a routine question about scheduling or paperwork. Instead, she found herself speaking with Tyler's father, David Morrison, whose voice carried the confident authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. Through a combination of charm and veiled threats, he introduced himself with elaborate courtesy before expressing his concerns about his son's experience in Sarah's mathematics class. David Morrison spoke in measured tones about the importance of academic rigor and appropriate challenge levels, framing his comments as support for educational excellence while actually questioning Sarah's ability to provide instruction worthy of his son's abilities. He mentioned Tyler's previous academic achievements, his standardized test scores, and his acceptance into advanced programs as evidence that any difficulties in her class must reflect instructional rather than student issues. The conversation was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, as Morrison managed to criticize Sarah's teaching methods while appearing to advocate for educational quality. He questioned whether her assignments were sufficiently challenging, whether her assessment methods accurately reflected student understanding, and whether her classroom management style created an environment conducive to learning. Most troubling was Morrison's casual mention of his relationships with school board members, district administrators, and community leaders who shared his commitment to educational excellence. These references were woven throughout the conversation in ways that seemed natural but clearly communicated his ability to create problems for teachers who failed to meet his expectations. Sarah maintained her professionalism throughout the call, explaining her educational philosophy, outlining her assessment strategies, and providing specific examples of Tyler's academic performance. However, she recognized that this conversation was not really about mathematics instruction, but about establishing power dynamics and testing her willingness to be intimidated. The call ended with Morrison expressing his confidence that they could work together to ensure Tyler's success, but his tone suggested that such cooperation required her accommodation to his family's expectations rather than any adjustment on Tyler's part. The implied threat was clear. align your teaching practices with our preferences, or face the consequences of challenging a family with significant influence. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment feeling the weight of the situation, settling around her like a heavy blanket. She was beginning to understand that her challenges at Riverside High extended far beyond normal classroom management issues into a complex web of family influence, institutional politics, and systemic inequity that had been developing for years. The following morning brought fresh challenges as word of her conversation with David Morrison had apparently spread through the influential parent network. Sarah arrived at school to find an email from Principal Rodriguez requesting a meeting to discuss concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding classroom policies and assessment practices. The principal's message was carefully worded to avoid taking sides while making it clear that Sarah's teaching methods had become a topic of administrative attention. Rodriguez suggested that they meet during her planning period to review her instructional approaches and ensure that they aligned with district standards and community expectations. Margaret Foster intercepted Sarah in the hallway before first period, her expression grave with concern that went beyond normal collegiality. The veteran teacher had heard through the faculty grapevine about the parent complaints and wanted to prepare Sarah for what was likely to be the beginning of a sustained campaign to pressure her into resignation. Margaret explained that this pattern had played out multiple times over her 30-year career, with promising young teachers arriving full of enthusiasm and innovative ideas, only to find themselves caught in political crossfire that had nothing to do with their actual teaching abilities. The families who wielded influence at Riverside had perfected a system for neutralizing educators who threatened their children's privileged status. The process typically began with informal pressure through phone calls and casual conversations, escalated to formal complaints about teaching methods or classroom management, and culminated in administrative action that forced teachers to choose between compromising their professional standards or seeking employment elsewhere. The beauty of the system was that it operated within legitimate channels while serving illegitimate purposes. As Sarah prepared for her meeting with Principal Rodriguez, she felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She could capitulate to the pressure and modify her teaching practices to accommodate Tyler's group, preserving her job while abandoning the principles that had drawn her to education. Alternatively, she could maintain her standards and face whatever consequences the Morrison family and their allies chose to impose. The martial arts training that had shaped her character for over a decade provided unexpected guidance in this moment of crisis. Her sensei had taught her that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from facing it with clear intention and unwavering principle. The discipline she had developed through countless hours of practice had prepared her for challenges that required patience, strategy, and the courage to stand firm when standing was difficult. Sarah Chen walked into Principal Rodriguez's office that afternoon with her head held high and her resolve crystallized into diamond-hard determination. She carried with her the detailed documentation she had been maintaining, evidence of the patterns she had observed, and a clear understanding of what she was fighting for. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was ready to discover just how deep the corruption at Riverside High truly ran. Principal Rodriguez's office felt smaller than usual as Sarah sat across from his mahogany desk, watching him shuffle through a thick folder of complaints. The afternoon light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face. Behind him hung diplomas and awards that suddenly seemed like decorations from another era, relics of a time when education felt simpler and more straightforward. Rodriguez cleared his throat and began reading from the typed complaints, with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this ritual too many times before. David Morrison's formal letter outlined concerns about inappropriate assessment strategies, inflexible teaching methods, and failure to accommodate diverse learning styles. Each phrase had been carefully crafted by someone who understood educational buzzwords well enough to weaponize them. The second complaint came from Marcus Webb's parents, who questioned Sarah's classroom management abilities and suggested that her confrontational approach was creating an environment that hindered their son's athletic performance. They referenced his previous academic success and wondered whether the stress of her class might jeopardize his scholarship opportunities. Jessica Kane's mother had submitted the most sophisticated complaint, a 3-page analysis of Sarah's teaching philosophy that managed to sound supportive, while systematically dismantling every instructional choice she had made. The letter praised Sarah's enthusiasm while questioning her experience, complimented her creativity while criticizing her methods, and expressed confidence in her potential. While demanding immediate changes to her approach, Rodriguez set the papers down and rubbed his temples with the gesture of a man who had aged years in recent weeks. He spoke carefully about the delicate balance between supporting innovative teaching and maintaining community relationships that kept the school functioning. His words carried the weight of political reality rather than educational idealism. Sarah listened to each concern with growing clarity about what she was truly facing. These were not parents worried about their children's education, but power brokers protecting their investment in a system that served their interests. The complaints revealed more about the writers than about her teaching, exposing a network of influence that operated through carefully maintained facades of reasonableness. When Rodriguez finished his presentation, Sarah opened her own folder and began sharing the documentation she had compiled over the past month. She presented specific examples of manipulative behavior, detailed logs of classroom disruptions, and evidence of coordinated efforts to undermine her authority. Her voice remained steady as she outlined patterns that revealed calculated psychological pressure, rather than typical teenage rebellion. Rodriguez examined her evidence with the uncomfortable recognition of someone seeing familiar problems from an unfamiliar perspective. Sarah's meticulous documentation painted a picture of systematic harassment that the administration had chosen to ignore rather than confront. The principal found himself facing the choice between challenging influential families or sacrificing another promising educator. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway that grew louder as it approached the office. Through the partially open door, they could hear Tyler Morrison's voice raised in what appeared to be a heated argument with another student. Rodriguez sighed and moved toward the door to investigate, but the situation escalated before he could intervene. Tyler burst into the office without knocking, his face flushed with anger and his usual composure completely shattered. Behind him stood a smaller sophomore named Kevin Martinez, whose tear-stained face and trembling hands told a story that needed no explanation. Tyler began demanding that Rodriguez punish Kevin for making false accusations about an incident that had occurred during lunch period. Kevin's voice shook as he tried to explain what had happened, describing how Tyler and his friends had cornered him in the bathroom and forced him to hand over the money he had earned from his part-time job. The details emerged in fragments between sobs, painting a picture of systematic extortion that had been going on for months. Sarah watched Tyler's reaction with the trained eye of someone who had spent years studying human behavior through martial arts. She could see the micro-expressions that revealed his true emotions beneath the manufactured outrage, the tells that indicated deception rather than genuine indignation. His body language screamed guilt even as his words proclaimed innocence. Rodriguez found himself trapped between competing narratives from students whose families occupied vastly different positions in the community power structure. Tyler's polished presentation and family connections stood in stark contrast to Kevin's obvious distress and limited social capital. The principal's hesitation revealed the institutional bias that had allowed such situations to persist. Sarah made a decision that would change everything, drawing on the confidence that years of martial arts training had instilled in her. She stepped forward and addressed Tyler directly. Her voice carried a quiet authority that cut through his bluster and demanded attention. She asked specific questions about his whereabouts during lunch, his knowledge of Kevin's employment, and his understanding of the school's policies regarding harassment. Tyler's responses grew increasingly erratic as Sarah's calm persistence exposed inconsistencies in his account. His practiced charm began to crack under pressure from someone who refused to be intimidated or manipulated. The arrogance that had served him so well against other adults proved ineffective against someone who had learned to read human nature through disciplined observation. The confrontation intensified when Tyler made the fatal mistake of stepping too close to Sarah in an attempt to intimidate her physically. His movement was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but clear enough to constitute a threat. What happened next would become legend in the hallways of Riverside High. Sarah's response was so swift and controlled that Rodriguez barely saw it happen. One moment Tyler was looming over her with aggressive posture, and the next he found himself on the ground with his arm gently but firmly controlled in a position that made resistance impossible. Sarah had applied a basic Aikido technique with such precision that Tyler was immobilized without being injured. The technique lasted only seconds before Sarah released him and stepped back, but those seconds shattered every assumption about power dynamics that had governed Tyler's behavior. Throughout his school career, he scrambled to his feet with his face burning with humiliation and his eyes wide with shock. For the first time in his life, he had encountered someone who could not be bullied, bought, or manipulated. Rodriguez stared in amazement as the young teacher who had seemed so gentle and accommodating revealed capabilities that none of them had suspected. Sarah's calm explanation that she held a third-degree black belt in traditional karate recontextualized everything they thought they knew about her. The quiet confidence that some had mistaken for weakness was actually the self-assurance of someone who had nothing to prove. Kevin Martinez looked up at Sarah with something approaching awe, recognizing that someone had finally stood up to the bullies who had made his life miserable. Other students began gathering in the hallway, drawn by the commotion and staying for the unprecedented sight of Tyler Morrison looking genuinely afraid. The news spread through Riverside High with the speed that only teenage gossip networks can achieve. Within an hour, every student knew that the mild-mannered math teacher had revealed martial arts skills that could neutralize the school's most intimidating bully. The story grew with each telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. Someone had finally proven that Tyler Morrison was not untouchable. David Morrison arrived at the school within 2 hours, his expensive suit and carefully practiced outrage failing to mask the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed system was collapsing. He demanded meetings with Rodriguez, threatened legal action, and made phone calls to board members who had always returned his calls promptly. This time, however, his influence met an immovable object in the form of security footage that clearly showed his son's aggressive behavior and Sarah's measured response. The video evidence eliminated any possibility of spinning the incident in Tyler's favor. His attempt to intimidate a teacher had been captured from multiple angles, and Sarah's defensive technique had been so precisely controlled that no reasonable person could characterize it as excessive force. The footage revealed Tyler as the aggressor and Sarah as someone who had responded with remarkable restraint. Margaret Foster watched the events unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and concern, recognizing that Sarah had won a crucial battle while potentially escalating a larger war. The veteran teacher had seen promising educators destroyed by families with less influence than the Morrisons, and she worried about the long-term consequences of this confrontation. The student body's reaction exceeded everyone's expectations. Kevin Martinez became a hero overnight for having the courage to speak up, while other victims of Tyler's group began coming forward with their own stories. A pattern of systematic bullying emerged that the administration could no longer ignore, especially with security footage and multiple witnesses supporting each account. Jessica Kane and Marcus Webb found their own positions suddenly precarious as students who had previously been too intimidated to speak began sharing experiences of manipulation and harassment. The carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbled as the true nature of their behavior was exposed to public scrutiny. Sarah continued teaching as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Her classroom became a sanctuary where students felt safe to take intellectual risks and ask genuine questions. The atmosphere of fear and calculation was replaced by one of curiosity and mutual respect. Her mathematical lessons took on new meaning as students saw learning as empowerment rather than competition. The three bullies found themselves isolated for the first time in their school careers. Tyler's swagger was replaced by nervous glances. Over his shoulder, Marcus discovered that physical intimidation no longer worked when everyone knew someone could neutralize it. And Jessica's social manipulation lost its power when students stopped caring about her approval. Principal Rodriguez implemented new policies regarding harassment and bullying, finally taking action that he had avoided for years. The school board, faced with undeniable evidence and shifting community sentiment, supported measures that prioritized student safety over political considerations. David Morrison's influence, while still considerable, was no longer sufficient to shield his son from consequences. Sarah's revelation about her martial arts background inspired other students to explore their own hidden strengths. A self-defense club formed with Sarah as the faculty sponsor, teaching students not just physical techniques, but the mental discipline and emotional control that made real strength possible. The club became a symbol of empowerment for students who had previously felt powerless. The final confrontation came 3 weeks later when Tyler made one last attempt to reclaim his lost status. He cornered Sarah after school in the empty parking lot, believing that without witnesses he could intimidate her into backing down. His desperation had overridden his judgment, leading him to make a threat that would seal his fate at Riverside High. Sarah's response was swift and decisive. She immobilized Tyler with another precise technique, held him just long enough for security cameras to record his aggressive approach and her defensive response, then released him with advice about finding better ways to channel his energy. This time, there would be no family influence sufficient to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Tyler Morrison was expelled from Riverside High the following week, his college prospects shattered and his family's reputation permanently damaged. Marcus Webb was suspended and removed from the football team, while Jessica Kane found herself shunned by the very social circles she had once dominated. The power structure that had seemed so permanent proved fragile when confronted by someone who refused to be intimidated. Sarah Chen finished her first year at Riverside High with test scores that exceeded district averages and student evaluations that praised both her teaching ability and her dedication to creating a safe learning environment. She had not only survived the challenge, but had transformed the culture of the school in ways that would benefit future generations of students. The math teacher who had arrived with dreams of inspiring young minds had accomplished something far greater than she had imagined. She had proven that integrity and courage could triumph over influence and intimidation, that true strength came from discipline and principle rather than money and connections. Her martial arts training had provided the physical skills necessary to defend herself, but her character had provided the moral courage to stand up for what was right. Years later, Kevin Martinez would credit Sarah Chen with changing the trajectory of his life, giving him the confidence to pursue his own dreams without fear of bullies. Dozens of other students would carry similar stories, testament to the power of one person's refusal to accept an unjust system. The hallways of Riverside High still echoed with teenage voices and the sounds of learning, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Students walked with greater confidence, teachers felt empowered to maintain high standards, and bullies learned that their behavior would not be tolerated. Sarah Chen had not just defended herself that day in Principal Rodriguez's office, she had defended the very idea that schools should be places where everyone could learn and grow without fear. The quiet math teacher with the gentle demeanor and hidden strength had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to intimidation is simply refusing to be intimidated. Her legacy would inspire countless others to find their own inner strength and stand up for what they knew was right, creating ripples of positive change that would extend far beyond the walls of any single school. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.